Hello, and welcome back to AP Environmental Science. Today I want to talk specifically about the human population. And last time we talked about population dynamics and how populations work, what are the equations to talk about growth and things like that. But today we want to apply that specifically to us, right? So there's some sobering facts that you probably ought to know. And this is going to be sort of the heart of the course because it is the human population and the size of the human population, in addition to our actions, that create all of the environmental issues that we're going to be talking about. And we will talk about all of these things. What about safe water, sanitation, nutrition, right? All of these things are going to affect not just quality of life, but they're going to affect the quality of the environment. Poverty versus affluence, these things both have impacts on the environment. And remember that the PowerPoint is available to you on our learning management system, so you can actually sit down and read these facts, but they will come up in class again. So just like every other population, our expansion is caused by the fact that our biotic potential is exceeding the environmental resistance. And what that directly translates to is that birth rates exceed death rates. We have enough resources to continue having ideal growth, right? We have exponential growth. Now, we're starting to slow down, which is one of the things we're going to talk about. But our population is still growing, and in some cases growing rapidly. There are over 7 billion people on Earth. And basically, if you looked at it like this, if everybody stood up, called their own name, and then sat down in a reasonable amount of time, a couple of seconds, it would take somewhere around 600 years to complete roll call. And if the population continues to grow by 2050, it would take 1,000 years to do that, right? And I think that's kind of a really interesting and sort of not very useful fact, but I think it puts in perspective the number of people that we're talking about. So here is your first mini quiz question. What is not an impact of population increase? And as our population gets bigger and becomes more affluent, the rise in consumption that follows? An increase in infectious disease, biodiversity loss, depletion of fisheries, or an increase in arable land? Well, more people living closer together, density-dependent factors, we're going to have an increase in infectious disease. We also take up a huge amount of space and we eat a lot of stuff, and that puts pressure on our neighbors. Biodiversity loss, depletion of fisheries, and we'll talk about all of these things in class. We do not, however, as we grow, get more land. What we've got is what we've got. And in fact, not only are we just simply taking up more space, which decreases arable land, we're degrading the land that we have, and so that also decreases the amount of arable land. So number 4 is the answer. So historically, the human population, has been sort of just hanging around, right? It took us basically all of the time since we evolved, somewhere around 300 to 350,000 years ago, if the latest fossil finds are accurate, to reach 1 billion people, right? We don't do that until 1800. Yet, in the last 200 years, we've added over 6 billion people. That's amazing. So, since 1963, the world's population has risen by Since 1963, the world's population has risen by 100%. We have doubled our population in the last 60 years, right? That's an amazing, less than 60 years, actually, just over 50 years. Remember, it took us to the year 1800. So it took us hundreds of thousands of years to get to 1 billion, and we grew 3 billion in 50 years. That's an amazing thing. Now, there are different models that are predicting how large we will get, but if we continue to grow the way that we are growing now, the minimum population that we can have is 9.1 billion people. So we are headed to 9 billion no matter what happens. Now, unless something catastrophic happens and lots of people lose their lives, which is a terrible, terrible solution to population problems. We never want to sacrifice people for the population conversation. What we need to do is understand that our population is going to grow, and then we need to figure out how to deal with that growth and maybe it's a good idea to bring that down to zero population growth. You can decide what you think about population growth. We'll talk about different worldviews, and they range from that catastrophic sacrifice everybody sort of doomsday worldview, all the way to the it doesn't matter how many people we get because we're smart enough that we will figure it out. And so you'll have to figure out on that curve where you are. But in the last 200 years, which of the following has had the least impact on human growth rates? Natural disaster, improved sanitation, improved healthcare, vaccinations and other disease prevention methods, or improvements in nutrition? Well, the four improvements that we've made have so greatly changed our ability to survive that natural disasters actually only take a very small number of people comparatively for every event. So we're not really dependent on, in terms of population growth, natural disasters. We have been able to explode as a species because we've been able to take control of our health and disease, our bodies, and all of the kind of things that used to affect us before, disease, injury, all of that. Now we have medicine, we have ways to survive, and survive we have. We also have better food. People always talk about that the average human today is significantly taller than the average human even 100 years ago. It's not because we've evolved, it's simply because we're able to reach our maximum potentials because of the leaps and bounds we've taken in the area of food, right? And clean water, which brings us to the sanitation thing. Sewage, right? Being able to remove that from society, the disease-causing components there, being able to clean water, and then being able to, that water, and then being able to clean new water coming in has prevented all kinds of death. And then the other thing is, because of all that, there's an increase in the number of women who actually do reach childbearing age. And so more women get to the point where they can have babies. So there's lots of reasons for our population to be growing at such a huge rate, right? So which of the following statements is true? The human population has always grown about the same rate. Prior to the 1800s, the human population remained steady state carrying capacity maintained by diseases and other natural enemies and disasters. There's every indication that the human population will reach a maximum of no more than 8 billion. The rapid increase in human population numbers during the last 200 years is mostly due to increased birth rates. And because they are influenced by our nature, human birth rates are similar around the globe. So which of these is true? Well, it turns out that prior to, this kind of review question, prior to 1800s, we are pretty much kept around at carrying capacity. And then we, by all of our technological developments, right, have been able to extend that carrying capacity. And we're not really sure what our new carrying capacity is. We don't grow at the same rate. We exploded, right? We know we're going to hit over 9 billion, right? We don't have increased birth rates, we have increased survival, and those are two different things. We don't have increased birth rates, we have decreased death rates, and we'll talk about that more when we talk about demographic transition. And human birth rates around the planet are not similar. It depends on where you live as to the number of children you are most likely to have, which is something we will also talk about because it's a very important concept. So let's talk about growth. Okay, so human populations grow or decline through the interplay of births, deaths, and migration. It's all about how many individuals are coming into the population and how many individuals are going out of the population. And that could be because they are moving in and out, or because they are being born, or because they are dying. And so the two big quantities that we're going to start with are birth and death rates. And crude birth rate, which is the number we'll use, and we'll just call it birth rate, but CBR is the number of births per year divided by the current population, and it is always per 1,000 people. Okay, and so how many people are being born or dying per 1,000 people. Then we can use the birth rate and the death rate to determine the growth rate. And we'll start with the natural rate of increase. Natural means that no one is coming in and no one is going out. So for instance, the population of Earth, you would calculate the natural rate of increase because no one leaves Earth and no one comes to Earth, right? It's a closed population. But when you're talking about countries or regions, city-states, whatever, you really are going to want to deal with the real rate of increase, and that is the birth rates plus immigration, whoever is coming into the population, minus the death rate and the emigration, whoever is exiting the population. Now remember, these are all measured per 1,000, so in order to get a percentage, we have to divide those numbers by 10. Okay, so birth rates, or birth rates plus immigration. You can also do birth rates minus death rates plus migration, because if they're emigrating overall, it's a negative number, and if they're immigrating into the country, it's a positive number. So you'll see it written either way, right? So it might in fact be CBR minus CDR plus M, right? And so you divide it by 10. Now, once you get this growth rate, you can actually figure out how long it'll take for a population to double, and that is the doubling time equation, and it is 70, which is a constant, divided by the rate of increase, right, which you convert to a percentage, and that will give you the doubling time. You need to know these equations. You need to know these equations. Okay, so let's talk about birth rates. Birth rates, total fertility rate is the number of children a woman is going to have on average, just on average, right? And it varies from country to country. So birth rates overall are going to be dependent on the total fertility rate, right? And so if you look around the country, you'll see that total fertility rates are extremely high in less developed countries, and we're going to make this connection later on, but I just want to point it out. Sub-Saharan Africa has some of the highest, right? And then in industrialized or developed countries, you'll see lower total fertility rates. All right, so which out of these, right? The factors that affect birth rates and fertility rates include all except which of the following: the cost of raising children, immigration rate, infant mortality rate, and the availability of private and public pensions. Well, it turns out all of these affect birth and fertility except immigration rate. Immigration rate has no impact on fertility, but the more expensive it is to raise children, that is an environmental resistance in terms of having lots of babies. Infant mortality rate, if you know that more babies are going to die, you're more likely to have more babies, so that's going to increase it, right? And then the availability of private and public pension systems. This is about your children taking care of you when you're older, which is very common in many countries. So what we're talking about here are pronatal pressures. These are things that increase total fertility rate. And old age security, having your children take care of you when you're old, is very common in many, many countries. The more children you have, the more sons you have, the more likely you are to have old age security. Also, in lots of places, little hands mean more work, right? And more work means more money. And so child labor, more children means more money coming in because you can put them to work. The earlier that you get married as a woman, or the earlier that you start having children, the more children that you can have in your lifetime, right? So simply delaying marriage and the birth of children actually will decrease the number of children a woman has. Also, lack of education and employment opportunities for women. The status of women is very important. When women are in charge of their own reproductive rights and they are considered valuable, then they typically will choose to have fewer children, and that brings the growth rate down. And on top of that, not only do they have to know about family planning services, they have to have access to them. And family planning services really are talking about child spacing, teaching people how to space children out so they're not having kids back to back, access to contraception, also access to pre and postnatal care, right? So that you and your children are healthy before, during, and after the pregnancy. The other thing we see are cultural mores. Religious beliefs and cultural traditions and machismo are the last two things that increase total fertility rates. And these are the things that are actually the hardest to change, right? Because they are embedded within the culture. Machismo, for those of you that don't know, is the idea of that male superiority and men wanting to have sons and men dictating the number of children that women can have. And we will talk about this more as we look at individual countries. All right, so On that note, you have a follow-up question, and this is, reasons for having large families in developing nations include all of the following. Which of the following is least likely to be influenced by industrialization and technology? High rates of infant and childhood mortality, the requirement for many children to help with planting and harvesting if you're agricultural, low esteem for education for girls and in general, cultural mores and preferences for large families, or limited availability of contraceptives. Well, remember what I said, cultural mores are hard to change. Cultural expectations are a lot harder to change, and technology doesn't necessarily do that. Technology can allow your kids to survive. It can give you tractors to help you plant. It can help raise the status of girls. It can make family planning services accessible, but it's hard to change cultures. So what happens when you have high fertility is that you get locked into a poverty cycle. High fertility, lots of kids means lots of little mouths to feed and less resources to give each child, including education, because in most places you pay for school. Girls are not very important. Typically, girls are the last ones to go to school, which means they often don't go to school, right? So they don't have an education. And in many cases, parents can't afford school for any of their children. So no education, right, means one, they don't have a good handle on how to use the resources sustainably, right? And there's desperation. You're not going to not hunt an animal because it's endangered, right? If you're trying to feed your kids, you're going to do whatever you can to feed your children. And so overusing resources for survival leads to environmental degradation. Environmental degradation means that you have high infant mortality rates and you don't have a lot of resources, and so you get high fertility. And so it's a vicious cycle that continues in this high poverty. And infant mortality is highest in the least developed nations. This is a map you will see over and over and over again because all of these things are linked. Now there is good news, right? And that is that death rates are falling. Infant mortality rates around the world are falling, and that is phenomenal, right? But the downside of that is more people surviving, which is awesome, does mean there are more people in general. So it's very important to kind of follow up with decreasing the birth rate too, which is something that we will talk about later on. Okay. Now, what causes infant mortality rate? A lot of it has to do with infectious diseases. And you can see that all of this is like infectious disease. All of these things are infectious disease. So infectious disease is the #1 killer of children around the world. Then you also have poor prenatal care, poor postnatal care, and you have hunger and malnutrition. And those are all killers of children. In Africa alone, there are 11 million orphans. And part of that is because their parents are also succumbing to these things, right? Interestingly enough, when you take out communicable diseases and stuff like that, motor vehicle accidents are the leading cause of death among children worldwide. And here's the thing, though, you really only see these statistics becoming significant in developed nations where you have already overcome the childhood disease and childhood malnutrition situation, right? But, so when you take out communicable diseases and hunger, car accidents are the next one. Okay, so which of the following is not true about the effect of HIV/AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa? It's now the leading cause of death in the region. It's primarily transmitted through heterosexual contact. Many regions have lost farmers, teachers, doctors, and other professionals. Both orphaned and infected children are the result of AIDS in Africa, and compassionate societies should accept this as a solution to the population crisis. Well, this question is pretty obvious, and I put it in here not because I think that you're going to miss it or anything like that, but there is a philosophy in those population arguments that I mentioned earlier that we will explore further later, and that is that disease is natural selection, and that anyone who gets a disease should be allowed to perish from that disease because that is a way to keep the population down. That is a very anti-human thing to say, and it's fine if you think that, but just remember that that is a very nihilistic almost way to look at it, and it would be better to look for solutions that didn't violate people's human rights and things like that. And again, it's fine if you agree with that, but do think about the ramifications of a very anti-human policy. All right, so causes of human mortality, different in developed versus developing countries. In developed countries, it's going to be stuff like cancer, injuries, cardiovascular disease. In developed, the least developed, so developing countries, communicable diseases, hunger and malnutrition. Okay, so even though the world's population growth rate peaked during the middle of the last century, populations in the developing nations will continue to grow as they are guaranteed a higher probability for healthy lives for their children. Until they are guaranteed. The proportion of the world's populations in developing nations will become larger. The world's fixed amount of resources must be divided among more consumers. Environmental damage caused by humans will increase in the foreseeable future. Yes, all of that. Okay, so when we think about the doubling time for human population, this is going back to the doubling time thing. You can see that, remember, it's based on the annual rate of increase. The higher the growth rate, the shorter the doubling time. So I just put this in here so you could see that exponential decline, right, of population growth. Sorry, couldn't think of what I was going to say there. Now here's the catch, though. Let's say that you have a really high doubling rate, right? You'd say your country is going to double in 35 years. And there are countries around the world right now that will double in 30 to 40 years. So let's say that you're one of those. So you figure out a way to compassionately drop your birth rates, right? And so you bring your population almost immediately to zero population growth. Here's the catch. It will take time for the population to catch up with the decreasing growth rate. And so this is called population momentum. There is a lag time, a population lag time, where you will continue to see the population getting bigger and bigger and bigger until it starts to match the declining growth rate and you start adding fewer number of people. Now here's the thing. Your population will continue to grow as long as you have a growth rate. It's about decreasing the number of people you add per year. You will always add to your population, and you want to because that's how you compensate for people who exit your population through death, right? And so you need to compensate. You always need to have a certain number of individuals. You just want the birth rate and the death rate to match if you don't want a growing population. But here is the peak growth rate. This is the number of people added to the population. Same thing here, right? And so when you have those big growth rates, right, you're going to add more people. But here's the catch. When you break the population down by age, when you're adding people to the population, most of those people are babies. And if you're talking about the global population, all of those people are babies. It will take time for that really big group of people to have babies themselves. And even if they have fewer babies, there are more of those individuals, so there will be more babies. Okay, and so when you have this population here, you're going to continue to grow and grow and grow. What you're looking at here is called a population pyramid, by the way. It's an age structure diagram. We break the population into the pre-reproductive ages, the reproductive ages, and the post-reproductive ages. So these people are not having babies right now. These people are having babies. These people are old. They're old people. Okay, and so we use these to tell us very interesting things about the population. So if age structure diagrams were drawn for the following countries, which would have the broadest base? In other words, I'm asking you, which one would have the most babies? That would be Nigeria. It is the least developed country out of these. It has a very youthful population because it has a very high total fertility rate. Remember, we said sub-Saharan Africa has a very high total fertility rate, which means they're having lots of babies. So this population will have lots of population momentum because all of these babies will someday have babies, or at least the ones who survive and choose to have babies. Okay, so when we look at a population structure, it actually tells us the future of the population. You could have a population that is expanding rapidly, right? Like sub-Saharan Africa, lots of babies. You could have fewer babies, but still more than people are dying, and so you're expanding slowly. This is slow growth. Zero population growth means you have as many babies as you needed to replace the population. And then you have declining or negative population growth, which means you're not having enough babies to replace the people who are dying, right? And so your population's getting smaller. So which age group is the determining factor for population growth or decline in a country? This is a kind of summarizing question. It's babies, pre-reproductive. When you look at this bottom cohort, that's going to tell you what the immediate future and long-term future looks like. Okay, so let's look at some countries in sub-Saharan Africa. When we look at Kenya, we can see that they had a huge pre-reproductive population in 2009, right? When we look at Nigeria, you can see the same thing, right? Okay, I don't know what it's doing right now. Hold on. Okay, and so when you look at Kenya in 2050, you can see that you have this big group right here. Those were the babies, right? They're now in their 40s. And so even though they had fewer children than their parents had, it's still going to be an echo that's very large. Okay. Here we go. Here's Nigeria in 2050. Same thing, except in Nigeria, they're not actually predicted to decrease the number of babies that they are having, whereas Kenya has a very active family planning system that's put into place. And we'll talk about Kenya later on. All right, the U.S. Okay, our population in 2009, whoa, we have this like kind of huge thing. This is the baby boom generation. This is that post-World War II generation. And this is the echo of that generation. Okay, this is the echo of that generation. All right, so as baby boomers reach retirement, there are a bunch of them. What we will find is citizens will have to contribute more to Social Security to support them. The cost for health care for all citizens will be reduced, or unemployment will rise. Well, on the plus side, unemployment will actually not rise because they're all retiring and there's a bunch of them. So that means more jobs. There are a bunch of them. They're old. And old people usually have health issues, so that is going to be a huge burden on the healthcare system. And the rest of us will have to pay their Social Security. They've already paid into Social Security, but we're now paying their Social Security. Our children will pay our Social Security, and it keeps going on from there until Social Security either doesn't work anymore or continues to be yay and happy. All right, so when we look at the United States in 2050, though, we can see that we should level off, right? So we want to talk about what is the difference in the United States from, say, Nigeria or Kenya that allows us to have zero population growth and allows them to be growing so rapidly. Now, which of the following is not shown by the population profiles in the figure? That male babies are slightly greater than female babies, older females are slightly greater than older males. Wow, that made no sense. Older males. By 2050, the U.S. population will have grown to occupy all the available space in the country. During the 1990 census, there was a bulge in the population that corresponded to the baby boom, and by 2050, older individuals will represent a higher proportion of the population. Oh, and by the way, these guys get like huge. It's not because there are a million people who are like 85, it's that it's 85 and everyone older. So it's like 6 cohorts all put into one. Okay, so just a note on that. We don't know if we'll occupy all the available space in the country. We might assume that we could at that point because there'll be a lot of people, but we don't know that. Everything else we can pretty much directly get off that graph and with a little knowledge of history. Okay, so let's look at India. India in 2009, ooh, rapid growth and way more boys. We'll talk about that later. India in 2050, we have a boy bulge, right? India is working on making girls as valuable as boys, and so hopefully we will start to look like this, but we'll still have that boy bulge. So which of the following is cited as a reason why India's family planning program has not been as successful as it could be? The preference in India for boy children, the lack of widespread knowledge of contraceptive methods, the low status of women, or all of these? All of these. And we'll talk about that more later. Okay, I know we're approaching the 30-minute mark. We're just going to look at a couple more countries and then we'll be done. All right, Japan. right? Japan into, oh no, Japan. Okay, so they are experiencing negative growth, and we will talk about that more later on. 2050, they'll have a bulge. They will have way more people than their population can support, and so that is a problem. In Italy and many countries in Europe have the same problem as Japan, right? And so what is not included in what you can see in a population pyramid that has negative growth? Too few teachers for abundant children, too few productive working adults, the need for care for older citizens, decreased tax revenues, or changes in families and social structures. The first four we can really actually see in the population pyramid. We're going to assume there are changes in family and social structures because the number of children is changing, but we don't know that, right? We can't directly assume that from the population pyramid. Okay. All right. So now we're looking at China. China, 2009. They've had a couple of booms, and so they've got some bulges, but then they also have a one-child policy, or had one. They don't anymore, but they used to have one, and that had a huge increase. All right. So let's look at China in 2050. So you can see that the one-child policy had a significant impact, and they have incentives now to keep the total fertility rate low, and it is low. It's actually the same as ours, and so you can see that they start to level off, but you've got this boom and this echo and then this cut in here. Okay, so this is just to review for you what it looks like when you have these different countries in these different stages of demographic transition, which we will talk about later on. So this is a connect to later on, okay? And then you can also tell about individual events, and I've just put this in here just to show you, right? There's huge conflict, right? World War II, this would be the generation that fought World War II. Okay, and so you can see that cut in. You can tell about single events. And again, we'll talk about all this stuff more later on. Okay, so ultimately, when you put all of what we've talked about together, is we have a growing population, but it is not growing in the developed countries. It is growing exponentially in the developing countries. And that's something that we really need to figure out. What kind of impact is that going to have? So, sorry for going a little bit over. Make sure you've written down all your questions. We will talk about each of these things more. We'll work with population pyramids. We'll calculate growth rates. We'll look at pronatal pressures. We'll do all of that going forward. This is just your introduction. So thanks for listening, and I will see you next time.